Throughout automotive history, there have been quite a few significant engines designed and built, but none have had the following like the Chrysler Hemi. From its aviation roots during World War II to the 3 generations of street engines that began in 1951, you could say that the Chrysler Hemi has been everywhere and done it all. It's been at the bottom and has enjoyed life at the top. It is racing royalty and street race famous. Come along with us here in the Gearhead Lounge as we document all 3 generations through this compilation of videos, from its humble beginnings to the last model year of the greatest of all time, the famous and infamous engine the entire world has come to know and love, the Hemi. When it comes to Mopar products, you can be sure that you're going to encounter one of the most out-of-the-box, in-your-face, I don't care what you like this now, stuff you'll ever encounter. From engines to suspension systems to the overall car or truck, Chrysler products are just different. They can be polarizing. You either love them or you hate them. That's because for decades, the divisions of Chrysler, Dodge, and Plymouth have been pushing the envelope, venturing into the unknown and setting new trends. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose, but they're always striving to be different. Case in point, let's take a look at the Chrysler Hemi. Just saying that 4-letter word evokes a feeling of extreme awe for most car enthusiasts. But what is it about a piece of machinery that has spanned across the decades, ascended from a household name to a legend, only to be reborn and rise to legendary status once again? The engine that has literally built and broken careers, powered the quickest drag cars on the planet, and has even been instrumental for the success and growth of many a YouTube creator. In this video, we're going to look at the very first generation of the fabled Chrysler Hemi engine. So, what is a Hemi?
Hey! That thing got a Hemi? Yeah. Sweet.
Well, I'm far from an engine guru, but I'll do my best to put it as simply as possible. The internal combustion engine as we know it utilizes what's known as a combustion chamber in order to ignite the air-fuel mixture and house the valve openings in the cylinder head. Combustion chambers come in many shapes, including wedge, bathtub, pent roof, and hemisphere. It's the hemisphere that we're going to look at. As you can probably tell, the Hemi gets its name from the combustion chamber being in the shape of a hemisphere. It's officially called a hemispherical combustion chamber, but Chrysler trademarked the name Hemi during the 2nd generation of this engine. Its major advantages come from valve size, valve placement, and a centrally located spark plug. During engine operation, it's the igniting of the air-fuel mixture that generates the power. As the piston reaches the top of the cylinder, the spark plug ignites the mixture just in time for the expanding flame front to meet the piston just as it begins its down motion and push the piston down the bore. Ideally, placing the spark plug in a central location provides the best conditions for combustion. The flame front burns evenly all around the cylinder, which is preferred. Many other combustion chamber designs place a spark plug on the edge of the cylinder, causing a flame front that travels across the cylinder, which are in a large percentage of what we drive today. Believe it or not, the Hemi engine isn't exclusive to Chrysler products. Hemi engines have been around for well over 100 years. Now, details are kind of sketchy, but I believe that Alan R. Welch is credited for being the first to fully utilize a hemispherical combustion chamber in an internal combustion engine. Not that he invented it, but in 1908, he made the best use of it. Welch's engine came in the form of a 5.5-liter overhead cam inline 4 that made 50 horsepower. Other auto manufacturers around that time to produce a Hemi engine were BMW and Peugeot, which was actually more of a pent roof design than Hemi. Another area where the Hemi was mass-produced was in aviation. One of the largest manufacturers was Pratt & Whitney, who utilized the Hemi design in the radial engines they produced not only for World War II fighter planes, but other aircraft as well. Now this is where Chrysler enters the story, on the aviation side. Before World War II, the United States began the task of modernizing their military. For their airplanes, most engines were of the radial design. While they were good at producing power, they limited the top speed of the airplane due to the engine protruding into the air as it traveled over the fuselage, producing drag. In 1941, Chrysler entered into a contract with the American military to develop a 2,000 horsepower engine in a V configuration. What they came up with was a monster of an engine. They developed the Chrysler 42220. Now, before I go any further, the name of this engine uses Roman numerals. I could say IV 2220, but it just doesn't sound right. I believe it should be pronounced as the Roman numerals are saying. So, they produced the Chrysler 42220 that evolved into the Chrysler 142220 and finally the 112220. It was a massive V16 engine that set the cylinder banks at a 60-degree angle as opposed to the more popular 90-degree configuration of most of our production V8 engines today. The V configuration takes up less frontal area, thus making the airplane more aerodynamic. The engine block is separated into two V8 sections with a propeller reduction gear mounted in between. Each of the 16 cylinders featured its own forged steel barrel sleeve that was topped by individual aluminum cylinder heads, each of which were built using hemispherical combustion chambers with twin spark plugs and overhead cams. The engine in its testing configuration was fed by a General Electric turbo supercharger. This setup featured an intercooler as well as an aftercooler, and the entire setup displaced 2,220 cubic inches, or 36.3 liters, producing 2,500 horsepower in its testing configuration. As far as the name goes, we've seen several configurations, but thanks to some sharp viewers, I learned something. The letters in the name stand for this. The X is for experimental, the I stands for inverted, and the V refers to the engine's V configuration, with the 2220 referring to the cubic inch displacement. The engine was mounted upside down and was narrow enough to fit within a 33.5-inch diameter circle, which greatly reduced frontal area, but at over 10 feet long, required that the sheet metal on the experimental P-47 to be completely redesigned. The experimental plane was known as the XP-47H. The new nose was longer and narrower than a regular P-47, thus making it much sleeker as it cut through the air. There's a debate over whether the XP-47H was actually faster than the P-47, as there are two conflicting stories. I'm inclined to believe that the engine was extremely successful, otherwise they wouldn't have kept developing it. But in the end, World War II was over at this time, and everyone started getting into jets, so the experimental aviation engine literally died on the vine. But that wasn't the end of the Hemi engine for Chrysler. In fact, it was just the beginning. With the success of the 112220, Chrysler began to pursue the use of a Hemi engine for production cars. Like we said before, Chrysler wasn't the only company building engines with hemispherical combustion chambers. One such company was Ardun, ran by the very well-known Zoroarkis Duntov and his brother. Ardun developed a top-end kit for the seriously choked-out Ford flathead engine. They featured cylinder heads with hemispherical combustion chambers that helped them achieve horsepower numbers in the 300 range. To find out more about the history of Zoroarkis Duntov, click on this link in the upper right-hand corner. Being that Duntov's cylinder head design was developed a few years before Chrysler came out with their street version, Many mistakenly believe Chrysler got their Hemi idea from Duntov, but as you can see, Chrysler's been working at this for a while, so no, it wasn't Duntov. While developing the airplane engine, Chrysler simultaneously focused their efforts on developing product for consumers. One of the areas of development was in the engine department. Chrysler's engine development department was tasked to test every engine combination they could find or think of. Their goal was to find the best possible combination that could be used in their production vehicles but still remain cost efficient. They tested all kinds of combinations, but one combination stood out in particular, and that featured an overhead valve configuration and hemispherical combustion chambers. They began testing it on a single-cylinder engine and found that the hemispherical head demonstrated better volumetric efficiency, meaning that it breathed much better, resisted detonation, and made more power with a 7-to-1 compression ratio than others could do with a 10-to-1 compression ratio. The next step was to utilize the same configuration on a production Chrysler engine. Heading up this project was James Zeter, younger brother of Fred Zeter, who was instrumental in the formation of Chrysler itself back in the day. James took a production flathead 6-cylinder and installed the Hemi head with a dual overhead cam setup. It was found that not only did the engine make more power, but it was actually smoother and quieter. Now you would think that Chrysler would take that news and completely revamp their engine line, but they didn't, mainly because of the sales failure of the DeSoto airflow. While I won't go into details, it made Chrysler reluctant to pursue new technologies or take unnecessary risks. In translation, Chrysler's business philosophy was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. At this time, 1943, Chrysler had yet to produce a V8 engine. In fact, they were so against utilizing new technology that when James Zeter made his proposal to Chrysler execs to produce these new V8 engines, he was opposed by his own brother, Fred, who said that Chrysler had made its money on straight engines, signaling that there was no way that Chrysler would make the move to V8 engines. However, the engine development department persisted, which led to a few heated arguments within Chrysler every time the subject was brought up. Finally, in 1948, top brass relented and allowed development of a prototype 330 cubic inch V8 with Hemi cylinder heads, the A182. After some research and development, Chrysler gave the go-ahead for production. They then developed the A239, a 331 cubic inch prototype that would be geared towards production. Chrysler head of development William Drinkard specified that he wanted a 100,000 mile engine. No major parts such as pistons, rings, and bearings were to fail before that point. Chrysler engineers worked feverishly developing an engine that would last the desired duration. The bore measured 3.81 inches and stroke was 3.63 inches, making the overall displacement 331 cubic inches, generating 180 horsepower and 312 pound-feet of torque. The key to any engine with hemispherical combustion chambers is, of course, the cylinder head design. Having the valves on opposite sides required a creative pushrod and rocker arm geometry, which became the trademark for the Hemi. This staggered setup featured a short rocker for the intake valves and a long rocker for the exhaust. With the spark plugs being centrally located, spark plug access was a definite concern. Their position placed them directly under the valve cover, which asked the question of how they would be able to route the ignition wires and how would anyone be able to change spark plugs without removing the valve covers. Engineers developed a unique valve cover with holes over each spark plug. A tube ran from the top of the valve cover down to the spark plug opening, sealed with rubber O-rings to prevent oil leaks. The ignition wires were built with an extended plug boot that could reach all the way down to the spark plug and seal itself to the valve cover. A trim plate was placed on top and the wires were routed out the rear to a dual-point distributor. After more than 8,000 hours and over 500,000 miles of testing, Chrysler was satisfied with their creation and named it the Chrysler Firepower. The new Firepower was introduced in the fall of 1950 for their 1951 model line. It was the standard engine for the New Yorker and the Imperial, while being an option in their Saratoga. With Chrysler's Firepower making headlines for the 51 model year, DeSoto and Dodge wanted a piece of the action and ended up developing Hemi-headed engines of their own. The weird thing about this engine development is that one would think that Chrysler would simply take their current engine design and rebadge them for the other divisions. But no, DeSoto and Dodge would develop their own designs that are similar enough to look alike, but unique enough to have practically zero parts in common. Starting with the original, Chrysler introduced the Firepower engine in late 1950 for their 1951 model year line, operating with a 7-to-1 compression ratio and topped off with a 2-barrel carburetor. The Firepower produced 180 horsepower and 312 pound-feet of torque. Chrysler enjoyed this exclusivity for a whole year. DeSoto was the first in 1952 to develop their own Hemi and introduce the world to the DeSoto Fire Dome, a slick little Hemi V8 with a 3.6-inch bore and 3.3-inch stroke measuring 276 cubic inches. Sporting a 7.5-to-1 compression ratio, the Fire Dome produced 160 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque through a 2-barrel carburetor. It was introduced in a DeSoto car that shared the same name as the engine. Dodge finished off the trio in 1953 with the Red Ram, the smallest production Hemi of the three. With a bore of 3.44 inches and a stroke of 3.25, the Red Ram came in at 241 cubes, producing 140 horsepower and 220 pound-feet of torque, and was only available in the 1953 Dodge Coronet. Between all three engines, naturally, competition set in, and all three engines grew in size and power from 1953 to 1959, with Dodge peaking at 315 cubic inches, DeSoto at 345, and Chrysler at 392. But the engine size isn't really the story here. The real story is how these engines got here and how the Hemi survived, thanks to James Zeter, Fred's brother. I mentioned James earlier as the engineer that first suggested using a Hemi V8, to which he was promptly shut down by Fred. Don't get me wrong, James didn't live in his older brother's shadow in the least. If not for James, we might not have the Hemi as we know it today. James was one of the founding members of Chrysler's Engineering Institute, formed in 1931. The institute was Chrysler's way of hiring entry-level engineers. They would balance class and work, and at the end of the program, you were a full-fledged Chrysler engineer with a master's degree to boot. But let's talk about Fred for a minute. In a nutshell, Fred Zeter was an engineer among engineers. Through his engineering prowess, he became chief engineer of Studebaker in 1914. He then brought in Owen Skelton and Carl Breer, where the three became a major engineering influence for Studebaker. They worked so well together that they became known as the Three Musketeers. In 1920, the Musketeers partnered up to form their own engineering company, Zeter Skelton Breer Engineering, and began consulting for other automotive companies, including Maxwell Motor Corporation and Studebaker Willys. In 1923, Walter P. Chrysler negotiated a 4-year management deal with Maxwell and almost immediately asked the Three Musketeers to close their business to become the engineering arm for Mr. Chrysler, which they did. Then, in 1925, the Maxwell Motor Corporation was dissolved and became the Chrysler Corporation. Over the years, the Musketeers revolutionized Chrysler into a top-notch automaker with many innovations to their credit, most notably rubber motor mounts. So by the time the 1940s rolled around, Fred was a big name in the automotive industry, and I'm sure he was influential in getting his brother James to join Chrysler as an engineer himself. So getting back to James, as far as engineering was concerned, he was just as much an engineer's engineer as his older brother Fred. Remember, it was James' initial research into a hemispherical head that led to the Hemi V8. Well, his research didn't stop there, and in 1951 wrote a freelance article for Motor Trend about the hemispherical combustion chamber and its impact in the industry. In that article, Zetor set the tone for Chrysler for years to come. He said that Chrysler's intention was to reinvent itself as an engineering and speed powerhouse, maximizing the Hemi's output by installing it in lighter, more dramatic-looking cars. Then, in 1952, James, now Vice President of Engineering, presented a white paper along with some of his engineering team to the Society of Automotive Engineers on the same subject. Well, word must have gotten out because Zetor was inundated with what he referred to as hot rod boys wanting to see just how much horsepower the firepower could make. So much so that many of them offered their own suggestions, to which many were taken to heart by Zetor. When it comes to making horsepower, the new firepower operated just like any other internal combustion engine out there, so it responded well to your basic hot rodding tricks. First, they experiment with the compression ratios of 7.5 to 1, 10 to 1, and 12.5 to 1, with every other aspect of the engine remaining unchanged. Obviously, the 12.5 to 1 compression ratio yielded the greatest gains, increasing horsepower to 193 with 330 pound-feet of torque. The bad news is that the high compression ratio required 130 octane aviation fuel. Confident that they were headed in the right direction, Zetor's team applied every performance bolt-on mod that they could think of to their test engine, codenamed K310. Free-flowing exhaust manifolds, new intakes, larger valves, individual carbs, head porting, camshafts, you name it. They ended up with a Hemi powerhouse that cranked out 353 horsepower and 385 pound-feet of torque. James Zetor was very happy with the results of testing and reported that the basic firepower cylinder gives performance comparable with Indianapolis engines, which have been developed for power without regard to any other purpose. He further concluded that we remain unalterably convinced that in the battle of the combustion chambers, the spherical segment chamber has demonstrated unquestionable supremacy. Armed with that newfound knowledge, Zetor had visions of competing in the Indy 500. I mean, imagine a company like Chrysler winning such a prestigious race. It was that aspiration that led to the development of the A311 project, the Indy engine. Fortunately, in 1951 for Chrysler, the AAA, or the American Automobile Association Contest Board, the sanctioning body that pretty much controlled Indy 500 racing back then, was looking for ways to get more people interested in racing Indy cars. At the time, the Offenhauser four-cylinder race engines pretty much dominated Indy car racing, but they were expensive to purchase, making it very difficult for the average Joe to compete. So, they allowed Detroit-built stock block V8s a chance to compete against the Offies. They also allowed an extra liter for the V8s, making the cubic inch limit of 335. The 331 firepower came in just under the wire. Fitted with all the go-fast goodies and topped off with a Hilborn mechanical fuel injection unit, Chrysler began developing the A311 to compete at Indy. They eventually ended up with a stock block firepower engine that ran on alcohol, producing over 400 horsepower at 5,200 RPM. In 1952, Chrysler installed their new engine in a Curtis Craft Indy Roadster and invited the AAA Contest Board to witness their testing session at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. With driver Joe Sestill behind the wheel, he completed 577 laps, averaging 134.35 miles an hour, a feat that destroyed the previous record of 128.922 miles an hour that was set earlier that year. Sestill was easily turning 137 mile an hour laps and topped out at 170 miles an hour on the straightaways. Numbers like this would surely dominate the 1953 Indy 500, sending the Offenhauser-powered cars packing. However, This success scared the AAA officials.
This is unacceptable!
So much so, they feared that if Chrysler were to win, the disenfranchised Offie drivers would exit IndyCar racing en masse, causing a major decrease in revenues. Not to mention, the overall public display of such performance got back to the Offenhauser teams, and they lobbied for the AAA to do something. AAA immediately changed their ruling and disallowed the extra liter for V8s, limiting the displacement to 271 cubes. This caused Chrysler to go back to the drawing board to see if they could come up with about the same power with 60 less cubes. Unfortunately, what they came up with only generated a little more than 350 horsepower at 5,800 RPM, and it just wasn't enough to even qualify for the big race. Although Chrysler didn't qualify for the Indy 500, the Firestone Tire Company liked what they saw and wanted a similar car equipped with the original 331 Indy Hemi for tire testing. By the time the car was built and delivered, the A311 Hemi was producing 447 horsepower and could lap Chrysler's Chelsea Proving Grounds at over 180 miles an hour. All while Chrysler was trying to qualify for Indy, there was a privateer by the name of Briggs Cunningham who wanted to win at Le Mans with his own cars, built by him in America. He struck up a deal with Chrysler and purchased the firepower engine at a discount. However, Chrysler offered no support. Any performance components were either created by Cunningham or supplied from an outside source. Although he never won at Le Mans, his best finish was 4th place driving his 1951 C4R, powered by a modified firepower producing 325 horsepower. As I always say, racing improves the breed, and it was through the efforts of racing that the firepower grew in power and size. In 1955, NASCAR racing was gaining in popularity, and coming off of Lee Petty's Grand National Championship in 1954, Chrysler wanted an even bigger piece of the action. At that time, Chief Engineer Bob Roger proposed to build a car that was centered on the performance potential of the Hemi and could compete in NASCAR. So, working alongside styling chief Virgil Exner, they developed the 300 letter series, beginning with the C300. Now, the firepower already powered several Chrysler vehicles, but it was the 300 letter series that really showcased the true potential of the engine. With a base price of a hefty $4,100, the new C300 featured heavy-duty suspension with a lowered ride height, performance exhaust, wire wheels, and a plush interior. The new body design was the first of Chrysler's forward design, coming from Exner, and was referred to as the $100 million look because Chrysler spent $100 million on the car's development. It was so influential that it prompted Ford and GM to revamp their entire lines. Under the hood was the 331 firepower Hemi V8 equipped with a solid lifter, long-duration race cam, adjustable rocker shafts, 8.5-to-1 compression ratio, and dual quad Carter carburetors. The engine setup was good for 300 horsepower, way more than Corvette's 195 and the T-Bird's 198. Plus, it was even 30 more than Cadillac's 270 horsepower engine. When it came to naming the car, the 300 represented the 300 horsepower the engine made, while the C may have stood for Chrysler or perhaps the fact that the car is a two-door coupe. But the C300 was built to compete in NASCAR, and compete is exactly what it did best. Driver Tim Flock drove a C300 in the Flying Mile at Daytona Beach to the tune of 127.58 miles an hour on a two-way average, shattering the previous record by over 7 miles an hour. The C300 went on to earn 18 victories and the Grand National Championship, pretty much the way they came off the showroom floor. On the streets, the C300 was a definite head-turner and offered premium all-around performance, something that was generally reserved for two-seaters. In 1956, Chrysler introduced the 300B, which was pretty much a 55 C300 with a few styling changes. But the real news was once again under the hood with a new 354 cube firepower Hemi V8 that boasted 345 horsepower with an optional 355 horsepower version with a 10-to-1 compression ratio. The 354 featured an increased bore of 3.9375 inches while keeping the same 3.625 stroke. The 300B became the first American production car to produce 1 horsepower per cubic inch. With a new power plant and a new 3-speed manual or optional torque flight automatic, the 300B set a new flying mile record at almost 140 miles an hour, all for a slightly increased price of $4,242. 1957 gave us a lot of great cars, and Chrysler was no exception. Their new 300C was an all-new design that was larger all the way around, including the engine. At 392 cubes, this was as large as the first generation Hemi would get. Standard power output was 375 horsepower with an optional 390 horsepower version. The new 392 engine came with an increased deck height of 10.87 inches over the 10.32 of the 331 and 354. Also, a 4-inch bore and 3.906 stroke. The taller deck height called for new head castings, ones that were a little thicker on the intake side to make up for the wider area on top. This would allow the continued use of the current intake manifold. The brand new styling was once again a Virgil Exner design that really set the tone for rear fins. Sharing its model line with the New Yorker, the 300C was offered in a coupe and convertible and features a new for 1957 torsion bar front suspension. The 300C was a hit on the streets as well as the track with a flying mile average of 145.7 miles an hour. It also won the NASCAR Grand National Championship for a 3rd year, as well as the Women's National Speed Trial Championship. For 1958, Chrysler continued with the letter series by moving to the 300D. There were subtle styling changes with a slight increase in the base engine that now makes 380 horsepower. Some cars came equipped with a Bendix electro-ejector fuel injection system. However, due to reliability problems, most were recalled and replaced with carburetors. As far as racing went in 1958, the 300D wasn't as fast as its predecessors. It could only manage 135 miles an hour in the flying mile. Unfortunately, due to the AMA agreement, Chrysler did not officially sponsor any racing teams that year, which affected the overall performance of the 300D. Check out what I said on the AMA agreement in the upper right-hand corner. While it seemed like the firepower was going to go on forever, the execs were looking to replace it. It seemed as if Chrysler was backing away from the performance vehicles, plus the Hemi engine was expensive to produce and slow to build. The competition was producing tons of V8s with wedge-style combustion chambers, much faster and cheaper, so it was time for Chrysler to develop a wedge engine program and come up with a Hemi replacement. What they came up with was the B-Series engine for the 1958 model year. These V8s ranged in displacement from 350 to 400 cubic inches, and all shared a 9.98-inch deck height. In 1959, Chrysler developed another B-Series block with a raised 10.725-inch deck height, hence the RB engine, R standing for raised. They were produced alongside the B engines and handled the larger displacements, starting with 383 cubes. Next was the 413, then the 426, and finishing with the 440. For 1959, the 300E was the first letter series car to not be powered by a Hemi. Instead, the new 413 wedge engine sat under the hood in place of the venerable 392 firepower Hemi. While the firepower was killed in the 300 letter series, it was still offered for one final year in the Crown Imperial. DeSoto and Dodge had already stopped production of their Fire Dome and Red Ram engines, which had grown to 345 cubes and 325 cubes respectively. By 1960, the Hemi was no more. The firepower had made quite an impact during its run of 9 model years in various models, and I didn't even mention the many industrial and marine applications in which it was used. The hemispherical combustion chamber showed itself to be a superior design and proved its worth first in the skies, on the streets, and on the track. Thanks to the engineering prowess and persistence of James Zeter, the firepower made it to production. And it was the design genius of Virgil Exner who developed the 300 letter series cars that truly showcased the overall potential of a Hemi engine in a vehicle that was designed around it. It's because of their efforts that the public got a positive dose of a Hemi V8 engine that was mass-produced for the streets. Even though it was canceled in favor of the cheaper-to-produce wedge engine, it would make a dramatic comeback 4 years later in an even more menacing form. The form that would cement the Hemi as a household name not only in America, but all over the world. Make way for the elephant. Stay tuned. In episode 1, we talked about how, during World War II, Chrysler designed and developed their own engine with hemispherical combustion chambers for use in aviation, how the project was canceled due to the war being over, and how that technology led to the Chrysler Firepower, the DeSoto Fire Dome, and the Dodge Red Ram Hemi street engines. It's quite a fascinating story of how things came together thanks to people like James Zeter, Bob Roger, and Virgil Exner. We also talked about how all of those engines were discontinued by 1960 due to the development of the cheaper to build and produce B and RB series engines. In this episode, we're going to talk about how the hemispherical combustion chamber was revived to produce a new kind of engine that once again dominated not only on the track, but on the streets as well. It's 1958, and Chrysler, along with Ford and GM, had decided to withdraw from financially supporting race teams, as well as not campaigning their own. As I said in the previous video, racing improves the breed. And, well, while there was still racing going on, auto manufacturers like Chrysler weren't sponsoring any teams, which meant that there was very little racing development going on, leading to an even smaller percentage of that technology making it to street cars. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday was more than just a saying. It was a truth and could influence the success or failure of an automotive brand. Even though the manufacturers weren't officially racing, people were still racing on the streets and at their local racetracks all across America. One of the easier forms of racing to get into was drag racing. The thing about drag racing is that you could do it anywhere, anytime. If a particular manufacturer's car had a reputation for being slow, it filtered down to the streets and had a direct effect on how the car sold. Fast cars equaled sales. At the same time in 1958, a few Chrysler Engineering Institute students, along with engineers, began to get together over lunch. All being fellow gearheads, and a few were weekend racers. They would talk and sometimes pool their knowledge to help each other individually with their personal race cars. Many of them realized that while separately they were meagerly successful, it was nothing compared to working as a team. So, in the fall of 1958, a group of about 25 Chrysler engineering students, along with Chrysler engineers, got together to form an after-hours racing team. They decided to pool their money together, use their working knowledge to build a race car that would put anything GM could build back on the trailer. What they came up with was Ramrod. Ramrod was a 1949 Plymouth business coupe. It's not clear as to why they picked it, possibly because it was light, or maybe because it was available for the right price. The Ram Chargers divided themselves into three groups. The first group would handle the chassis, the second group would handle body mods, and the third group would be in charge of the engine. Power for Ramrod was a salvaged 354 Hemi with 392 heads, and topped off with what could only be a prototype Tunaram intake. No doubt the inspiration to the car's initial name. The crew at Chrysler was just discovering the ramming effects of long intake runners, and no doubt served as the inspiration for their intake manifold technology that followed in the 60s, namely the line of wild-looking cross rams and box intakes. The engine was fed by a pair of Carter 4-barrel carbs with a custom-fabbed air scoop on top. The exhaust gases were handled by 8 individual exhaust trumpets that exited straight out of the front fenders for a real menacing look and one hell of a sound. The chassis group treated the coupe to a lifted suspension and a shortened wheelbase, moving the rear wheels closer to the center of the car. This was done to make sure that the weight transferred to the rear quicker, planting the rear tires to the road. With the shortened wheelbase, the body crew had the choice of either modifying the fenders or yanking them off, to which they performed the latter. With the raised ride height, the roof was chopped 4 inches to improve the aerodynamics. They pretty much turned a brick into a slightly smaller brick. But that brick certainly did run. It made its debut at the '59 NHRA Nationals in Detroit. Ramrod retired early due to a blown engine, but not before setting the top speed in its class at 109.75 miles per hour. The Ram Chargers continued to repair and refine the Plymouth as they campaigned it. When they returned to the NHRA Nationals in 1960, Ramrod was running 11s at 117 miles an hour, enough to win its class. With that class win, the Ram Chargers renamed the Plymouth the High and Mighty, also no doubt to the height of the intake manifold. Unfortunately, the curse of the Hemi struck again, as the NHRA introduced additional rules that limited how high a race car's crankshaft could be from the ground, and also limited the engine's overall weight per cubic inch, pretty much ruling the High and Mighty out of competition. However, that didn't stop Chrysler from racing. By 1961, the AMA ban was lifted, well, more like ignored, but lifted is still a good word. The Ram Chargers approached Plymouth and Dodge officials to see if they were interested in sponsoring them with a stock car to run, something that looked like what was on the showroom floors, making them highly appealing to young people. Plymouth declined. However, Dodge jumped at the chance and gave them a '61 two-door sedan, to which they took it to the U.S. Nationals, but lost in the semifinals due to a broken transmission. The race was won by Dino Don Nicholson. They fixed the car, and on that Monday, the announcer asked if the crowd would like to see Don race the Dodge. The Ram Chargers took their '61 and staged it next to Nicholson's ride, and promptly beat him. Enter Lynn Townsend. He joined Chrysler in 1957 as a controller and moved up to group vice president in 1958. By 1960, he was Chrysler's administrative vice president and then president in July of 1961. During that time of his rise, he was approached by his 2 sons who showed him that Chrysler products didn't relate to young people because in their terms, Chryslers were not cool. and that the Pontiacs and Chevys ruled the streets. But they also made him aware of the Ram Chargers and how they beat the fastest Chevy around. That was all Lynn needed to hear. He called the motor room at Chrysler Engineering and spoke to Tom Hoover, one of the founding Ram Chargers organizers. By the end of the conversation, Tom was made the race program coordinator for the engineering division. Through racing with the Ram Chargers, Tom was instrumental in taking what they learned from the High and Mighty's tall ram intake and developing a cross-ram intake manifold that could take advantage of the ram effect as well as pressure waves while remaining under the hood. This technology led to the development of the 413 Max Wedge engine. Max Wedge stood for Maximum Performance Wedge and was the performance engine for Dodge and Plymouth in their B-bodies. Dodge marketed the package as the Ram Charger, while Plymouth marketed theirs by calling it the Super Stock. The Max Wedge grew to 426 cubes in June of '63. With the Max Wedge becoming the dominant force in drag racing, Dodge and Plymouth also campaigned it in NASCAR. But it wasn't so dominant on the ovals. Again, what wins on Sunday sells on Monday, so Chrysler execs called on Tom Hoover and his team to see what could be done. In a meeting, Tom relayed that the problem was related to the design of the cylinder heads. The combustion chamber location contributed to shrouding of the valves, limiting flow. The bottom line was that the heads simply didn't flow as well as the competition, which prompted the execs to ask, what would it take to win Daytona Beach in 1964? Tom responded with that for the high output and the high airflow configuration, they had the most confidence in the hemispherical combustion chamber. With that, Tom and his team got the green light. Using much of the data they gathered from the A311 program, quickly got to work in adapting the original cast iron Hemi heads to the 426 RB engine, codenamed A864. The team modified the heads and the engine block to work together successfully, coming up with a 426 that was going to be strictly a 4-race only engine. On December 5, 1963, they developed a running prototype suitable for testing. Through endurance testing on the dyno, they simulated the 500 miles at Daytona. It's through this simulated racing environment that they ran into problems with the engine block cracking on the dyno due to extremely thin cylinder walls. By now, the '64 Daytona 500 was less than a month away, so they had to work feverishly to thicken up the cylinder walls, and on February 11th, during Daytona Speed Weeks, they were able to successfully cast 12 engine blocks strong enough for the rigors of the Daytona 500. Once the engines got to Daytona, it was pretty much a wrap. King Richard Petty took his Plymouth Belvedere out for a qualifying lap. The previous day, a Mercury set a new lap record of 169.014 miles an hour. Petty's qualifying lap destroyed the Mercury at 174.639 miles an hour. Plymouth driver Paul Goldsmith took the pole with a lap of 174.910 miles an hour. But it was Petty that took top honors by winning the race in his '64 Plymouth Belvedere. Goldsmith took third, while Jimmy Pardue finished second, all in '64 Plymouths. The Dodge entries finished fourth and ninth. Needless to say, the Plymouth dealerships were swamped following the race, with people wanting to drive home in the same car that won Daytona. But since the 426 Hemi was a race engine only, no one could purchase a Hemi-powered Chrysler product. Throughout the 1964 season, the 426 Hemi proved to be a very formidable competitor. The drivers had some issues driving on road courses due to the amount of horsepower the Hemi made, but it was a time of learning for each of them. Petty won the Drivers' Championship, although it was Ford bringing home the Manufacturers' Championship. NASCAR officials, as well as some drivers, were fearful that the Hemi could completely dominate the series, so much so that even Ford tried to legalize their new monster 427 single overhead cam engine. But more on this engine later. NASCAR didn't allow the engine into competition, but instead developed new homologation rules for the series for the 1965 season. In 1964, each manufacturer had to produce at least 500 versions of the same car that raced on the tracks. Also, the engine displacement limit was 7 liters or 427 cubic inches. Ford already campaigned to 427, while Chrysler's Hemi was at 426. Chevy had pulled out of competition in 1964, so they weren't even there. However, NASCAR officials could see a trend brewing that could ramp up speeds and competition to unsafe levels. As a result, for 1965, NASCAR raised the production requirement to 1,000 units, limited the engines to a single carburetor, and banned mid-size cars. Since Chrysler's Hemi really wasn't in any production cars anyway, it was ineligible for 1965, along with the Plymouth Belvedere and the Dodge Coronet, since they were mid-size cars. Chrysler and their drivers boycotted the 1965 season in protest, leaving Ford and Mercury to duke it out the entire season. However, that didn't mean that Chrysler had stopped racing the Hemi. No way. For 1965, the Hemi was used in many forms of racing other than NASCAR. In particular, 4 of them found their way to Bonneville, powering the land speed racer Goldenrod, where it brought the land speed record back to America with a two-way average of 409.227 miles an hour. That same year, Leroy Yarborough drove a Ray Fox Automotive-built Dodge Coronet, complete with a blown 426 Hemi, to a closed course record of 181.818 miles an hour. You could even find a Hemi thundering up Pikes Peak, several of them to be exact. One in particular was Paul Goldsmith's Hemi Belvedere. Although he qualified on the pole in the stock car category, a little off-course excursion prevented his finishing. However, Chrysler focused its major sponsorships on drag racing, where many of Chrysler's NASCAR drivers ended up. Even King Richard Petty campaigned a Hemi drag car. Chrysler had plans on dominating the superstock classes in NHRA and AHRA. Like NASCAR, the NHRA and AHRA had homologation rules, but not as strict. To be legal, Chrysler had to offer the Hemi in at least 50 vehicles. Once again, it was Tom Hoover and his team to the rescue. What they put together was a ready-to-go race car straight from the factory. The A864 package was Chrysler's race Hemi offered for off-road use, not meant for the streets. For Dodge, the A864 was an option for their 1964 330 and 440 cars, and Savoy and Belvedere vehicles for Plymouth, again offered as off-road only, not for street use. The package focused around the 426 race Hemi with cast iron cylinder heads and a 12.5-to-1 compression ratio. The intake manifold was Chrysler's dual quad cross ram intake cast in aluminum, topped off with a pair of Carter AFB 750 CFM carburetors initially, but switched over to the better performing 770 CFM Holley carbs right before the production run. About 70 prototypes were Carter AFB equipped. Exhaust gases exited using factory exhaust headers that funneled into a single exhaust, but featured cutouts when at the track. Customers had the option of either a 4-speed manual or a torque flight push-button automatic that transferred power to a sure grip differential with 456 gears. The cars themselves were lightened up for drag race use. The steel front fenders, hood scoop, doors with hinges, as well as the front bumper and brackets were all swapped out for identical pieces made out of aluminum. The radio and heater were deleted while the battery was moved to the trunk. The torsion bar front suspension was loosened up with lighter springs to help the front end transfer the weight to the rear quickly. The interior was stripped down to its bare essentials utilizing lightweight carpet, lightweight interior panels, deleted sound deadening as well as deleted undercoating. The standard seats were replaced with A100 van seats. The rear seats removed entirely. The inboard headlights removed, and all the glass was replaced with thinner, lighter units. How well did the A864 package work? So well that the Hemi completely dominated in the superstock classes in 1964.
Buster Couch punches the button, and they're off. And the Torque Flight takes the run with an 11.39 ET. Top end speed, 128.93 miles per hour.
For the 1965 season, the NHRA ruled that manufacturers weren't allowed to use exotic metals in the vehicle's construction, which meant that aluminum body panels were no longer legal. So Chrysler engineers got even more creative for the 1965 model year with the A990 Hemi drag package. Available for either the Plymouth Belvedere or Dodge Coronet, these cars received the same interior treatment as their 64 counterparts, but the front ends were lightened by the use of thinner gauge sheet metal instead of aluminum for the front fenders, hood, doors, and front bumper. Under the hood, the iron head 864 Hemi was replaced with the A990 Hemi that included lighter aluminum heads, aluminum water pump, and a cross-ram intake cast in even lighter magnesium. However, the super stock class Hemi race cars started going for more horsepower and faster numbers. Race teams began to alter the wheelbase as well as switch to nitromethane as fuel. These super stock cars began bleeding off into the AFX class, which would eventually lead to early funny cars and the full tilt monsters we see today. Unfortunately, Chrysler was still looking at selling Hemi street cars, and a shortened wheelbase Belvedere wasn't it. By mid-1965, NASCAR was feeling the pressure of a Ford-only competition and allowed the Hemi back into racing. So in 1966, Chrysler jumped back into NASCAR with the A117 Hemi. NASCAR still had its ban on large displacement, so this new race Hemi was based on the A864, sharing the same bore size, but with a shorter 3.5-inch stroke, measuring 404 cubic inches. Being down on horsepower, the A117 came equipped with a single 4-barrel box intake known as the bathtub. But it was enough for Richard Petty to win the Daytona 500, as well as bring home 8 victories, 15 poles, and 20 top 5s that year, in addition to finishing third in the championship points. To make the A117 legal for competition, Chrysler engineers were working on a more streetable version of the Hemi at the beginning of '65, with plans of not only homologating the Hemi for NASCAR competition again, but also to compete in NHRA's stock eliminator class. What developed for the 1966 model year was the A102. The A102 was very close to the race engine, except it displaced 426 cubic inches again. Using cast iron heads, the compression ratio was dialed back to 10.25 to 1, and a smaller solid lift camshaft was utilized for street use. Also, the dual quad cross ram intake was swapped out for a standard inline dual quad intake to simplify for the streets. Rated at 425 horsepower, the street Hemi obviously made much more, but just about every manufacturer was lowballing their horsepower numbers at that time. The first cars to receive the 426 Street Hemi as an optional engine were the 1966 Plymouth Belvedere and Satellite and the Coronet and Charger for Dodge. In 1967, the model lines included the Plymouth GTX. In addition to the Street Hemi, Dodge and Plymouth were still offering their Hemi drag package. In 1967, option code RO23 got you a Plymouth Belvedere, while WO23 got you a Dodge Coronet. Under the hoods featured a warmed-up A102 Street Hemi that sported an additional 50 horses. It was good enough for 13.5 quarter-mile times right off the showroom floor. In '68, the amount of Hemi cars grew with the addition of the Plymouth Roadrunner and Dodge Super Bee. The drag package option was also stepped up a notch with the LO23 and BO29 option for the Dodge Dart and Plymouth Barracuda, otherwise known as the Superstock cars. Built by Hearst, the Superstock cars were just that, built to compete in NHRA Superstock. They were stripped of any unnecessary weight or accessories, lightened extensively with fiberglass front end pieces, and modified rear wheel openings to accommodate larger drag slicks. Under the hood was a dual quad cross-rammed 426 Hemi with a 12.5:1 compression ratio. Horsepower numbers were rumored to be in the 540 range and were said to run constant 10-second quarter-mile times. In 1970, the mechanical camshaft was exchanged for a hydraulic lift camshaft. The Plymouth Belvedere ceased production, and while the Dodge Coronet shared the same platform, continued on, with the option for the Hemi being discontinued. However, Dodge and Plymouth redirected those Hemis into two brand new vehicles, the Dodge Challenger and a redesigned Plymouth Barracuda's new performance option, the Cuda. On the streets, the Hemi was a formidable power plant, but in stock form, it struggled against its sibling, the 440. The 426 Hemi was pretty much a tamed-down race engine with huge ports. Its power was generated in the higher RPM range, whereas the 440, while 45 horsepower shy of the Hemi, generated almost the same torque numbers at 3,200 RPM versus the Hemi's 4,000 RPM. This meant that with all other things being equal, a 440 could beat a Hemi from stoplight to stoplight. A modified Hemi, on the other hand, was a completely different story. Unfortunately, between the rising costs of car insurance, the continued tightening of emissions regulations, as well as the need for more fuel-efficient vehicles, there was just no room for the Hemi on the streets anymore. 1971 was the last year of the second-generation Hemi being produced for street cars. The racetrack, however, is where the Hemi lived and thrived. In 1967, NASCAR raised the cubic inch limit rules, and the 426 Hemi was once again a dominating force on the superspeedways. The 426 Hemi was designed and built to be in its element at high speeds, and while the Plymouth Belvedere and Dodge Charger weren't the most aerodynamic cars, the Hemi didn't really care. It won regardless. I believe that the Hemi reached its pinnacle in NASCAR in 1969 and 1970, the absolute best years for muscle cars. It was in 1969 that we were introduced to the Charger 500 and later the Charger Daytona. 1970 gave us the Plymouth Superbird. To get some in-depth information on the Charger 500 and Daytona, check out my video on the history of the Dodge Charger. In a nutshell, the Charger 500, Daytona, and Plymouth Superbird were developed in a wind tunnel to really use the air going around it at high speeds. The more radical Daytona and Superbird featured a 440 under the hood as a standard street engine with the Hemi as an option. However, the full-race NASCAR racer used the race Hemi exclusively. The unique nose cone and attention-grabbing rear wing was fully functional, making them really easy to spot from a distance. While they look somewhat bulky on the street-going homologation cars, they look rather menacing on the superspeedways, and the superspeedways is where they were designed to work. They worked so well that the first Grand National car to break 200 miles an hour was Buddy Baker driving a Charger Daytona at Talladega in 1970. While the street Hemi ended in 1971, the race Hemi ran in cars all the way up until 1975, until NASCAR imposed a cubic inch limit of 6 liters, or 366 cubes, causing Chrysler to introduce the LA-based 355 engine. By the 1976 season, the Hemi was gone from the superspeedways. But it wasn't gone from racing completely. In fact, just as the street Hemi was being discontinued in 1971, a savvy racer and engine builder named Ed Donovan introduced the drag racing world to his brand new Hemi-headed engine, the Donovan 417. As I stated earlier, the Hemi was a pretty dominant force in the NHRA, starting with the original firepower. Well, just as anything in racing, the quest for faster ETs and more power led to innovations in technology, particularly in fuels. Nitromethane became real popular with the faster Hemis. Nitro, not to be confused with nitrous, had been around for a long time, even decades before the surfers began using it in their drag cars. So engine builders were familiar with its characteristics. One thing they knew for sure was that it was a temperamental fuel and can be very unforgiving. The Hemi of choice back in that day was the first gen 392. There were plenty of them to be had and they reacted well with the fuel. However, to run nitromethane, you needed an engine with a pretty stout bottom end, and unfortunately that was one of the 392's shortcomings. According to this Hot Rod article from February 1972, Ed Donovan, like many racers of the day, preferred the first gen Hemi over the second gen 426 Hemi. So every time a 392 blew up, replacement blocks were getting harder to find. That's when Ed stepped in with his company, Donovan Engineering, to design an engine block that could address the shortcomings of the original 392 in a way that the average Joe racer could afford. What Donovan Engineering came up with was the Donovan 417. It was the original intent to keep all of the advantages of the original 392 while addressing the shortcomings. The end result was so much more. An aluminum engine block with chromoly wet sleeves that could be swapped out, and a girdle for strength. How well did the 417 do? In its debut at the 71 NHRA Super Nationals, John Wiebe ran a low ET of 653 to grab the number one qualifying position. However, he finished second due to blowing away his tires in the final round. Now don't get me wrong, 653 wasn't the fastest time ever at that time. I mean, Don Garlits had run a blistering 621 at the US Nationals that same year with the Swamp Rat 14, the very first rear-engine dragster that was also Hemi-powered, but with the 426. So the Donovan 417 wasn't about being the fastest, it was about being innovative enough so that by the end of the day, you were still running. The overall design of the 417 not only made it much stronger, but it saved money in the long run for repairs. Instead of replacing a rear engine block if you burned the piston, all you needed to do was yank the cylinder head off and install a new cylinder sleeve. It was this Donovan 417 engine design, along with the rear engine Swamp Rat 14, that changed Top Fuel forever. By 1974, the entire landscape of Top Fuel had changed. The front engine dragsters disappeared and were replaced by the safer rear engine dragsters. With the success of the Donovan 417, the stock block firepower Hemi remained mostly in street cars. However, in spite of the 417, there were still racers that still raced the RB 426 Hemi. So it was only a matter of time before someone saw the need to build a stronger RB Hemi. That someone would be Keith Black Racing Engines. Keith Black Racing Engines was already a successful engine builder, already having produced his own aluminum engine blocks. But I don't think even they could have imagined the impact they would have on the Top Fuel classes. Keith Black Racing Engines introduced their first all-aluminum Hemi in 1974. Like the Donovan 417, the Keith Black Hemi was an aluminum engine block with replaceable sleeves. This made engine repairs in the pits a cinch. Each subsequent generation brought new innovations that made the Keith Black Hemi stronger and more powerful. By 1984, Keith Black powered dragsters held every national record in Top Fuel. These days, a Top Fuel engine displaces a maximum of 500 cubic inches, usually around 496, and can produce 11,000 horsepower. A Top Fuel dragster can accelerate from 0 to 100 in less than a second while pulling 5 Gs off the starting line. A little more than 3.5 seconds later, you're 1,000 feet down the road barreling at over 330 miles an hour. Keith Black Racing Engines Hemi became the standard against which everything else was measured in Top Fuel. The Hemi is Top Fuel. I mentioned earlier that all the while Chrysler was dominating in NASCAR in 1964, Ford was coming up with a Hemi engine of their own. The 427 single overhead cam engine, otherwise known as the sock motor. Based on the 427 side oiler, The single overhead cam engine featured a single camshaft mounted atop a massive Hemi head, one per engine bank. These camshafts were synced together using a 6-foot-long timing chain hanging on the front of the engine, making it look colossal inside the engine bay. Power output was an impressive 616 horsepower at 7,000 RPM and 515 pound-feet of torque at 3,800 RPM. Chrysler countered with the A925, a dual overhead cam 426 engine that was referred to as the dual overhead cam Hemi. Although the combustion chambers were actually a pent roof design as opposed to being hemispherical. They produced 2 prototypes that never ran but were driven by an electric motor to test the valve train. Years later, it was told that former Ramchargers member David Rockwell and historian Stuart Pomeroy admitted that the A925 program was actually a fake endeavor in order to get NASCAR's Bill France to ban Ford's stock engine. Once the Ford engine was banned, all development on the dual overhead cam Hemi stopped. As awesome as the street Hemi was, it had a few drawbacks. It was an expensive to build, heavy race engine come street engine. Plus, the B and RB series engines utilized 3 engine blocks and 2 sets of heads to build the 383, 400, and 440. Chrysler's goal was to develop an engine that would cover these 3 engines with only 2 displacements, 400 and 444 cubic inches, using only 1 engine block. This would cut production costs as well as being able to fit in a larger variety of vehicles. In 1968, Chrysler came up with the A279, otherwise known as the ball stud Hemi. Of course, the main attraction were the cylinder heads. Utilizing the hemispherical combustion chamber, the A279 used the same valves as the 426, with the only difference being that the valves were placed in a canted position as if the entire combustion chamber was rotated. The rocker arm setup wasn't the same rail-mounted short long arm design as in the past. Instead, they were based on a straight 6-engine design that was used in Chrysler's Australian engines. They were mounted to a pedal stool using studs and rotated on a half-ball design, hence the ball stud name. The engine showed great promise. However, with the dark cloud of emissions regulations, a pending fuel shortage, and rising insurance costs, Chrysler stopped further development in 1969, with the 426 Hemi following 2 years later. For a great video on giving a breakdown on the ball stud Hemi and what happened to it, check out Vic's Garage. Click on the link in the upper right hand corner to watch the video. The 426 Hemi was a race engine through and through. If not for the need to continue racing, we would have never seen this phenomenal power plant on the streets at all. It dominated in NASCAR. It was the first to reach 200 miles an hour on the super speedways. It was so good, it was banned twice. It completely changed drag racing, Top Fuel in particular. These changes are responsible for modern Top Fuel cars running 300 plus miles an hour today. As a street engine, it had its ups and downs, but such are the perils when you go for mass production. Stifling a race engine for the street hampered its performance in some areas, so it would often take second place to its brother, the 440. However, it responded well to simple mods, so much so that a modified street Hemi was virtually untouchable. Fast or not, nothing compared to popping the hood on a Hemi-powered Mopar. Engines come and go, but very few have the legacy or the pedigree that the 426 Hemi enjoys. Chrysler originally produced around 9,000 engines, making them kind of rare. They're desirable enough to where a 426 Hemi powered car can add a couple zeros to the overall value of the car. A 426 Hemi car is the holy grail, the pot of gold, the pinnacle, the grand slam in the car world. But in its rarity, the 426 lives on in crate engines, allowing anyone with enough funds to build their own Hemi car just the way they like it without ruining an original. While there were certainly other Hemi engines produced around the same time, there are none like the 426 Hemi. It's a unique piece of machinery that was intimidating to own, dominating over all opposition, all-consuming if unleashed, yet beautiful to behold and sought after by countless. Chrysler engineers had no idea of the movement they began when they decided to go racing in a first-generation firepower, a movement that would begin almost 30 years later for what seems to be his final curtain call. Stay tuned. In a world burdened down with emissions regulations and fuel mileage requirements, the very last thing one would think the world needed was a new Chrysler Hemi engine. Isn't this the time to look towards the future and not the past? Could a new style Hemi survive in this day and age? The answer is a resounding yes. Previously, we discussed how, thanks to Tom Hoover, the second generation Hemi engine was developed to be a race-only engine to compete in NASCAR, and how that race engine eventually wound up in street cars to homologate it for NHRA and AHRA competition in addition to NASCAR. We also discussed the overall dominance of the 426 Hemi and how it was eventually banned from NASCAR competition, along with all big block engines due to the insane performance and safety concerns they created. Eventually, the Hemi found its niche in top fuel drag racing and is still going strong into this day. The street Hemi was produced from 1966 until 1971, and although it was primarily a toned-down race engine, it wasn't too bad as a street engine. It would be 32 years before the world would see a Chrysler Hemi engine produced on the assembly lines again. During that time, it was Chrysler's LA engine that was doing the brunt of the work. Beginning in 1964, the LA engine was released to the world as a 273 cubic inch V8. Over the years, it's taken form as the 318, 340, and 360 engine we've known throughout the 1970s and 80s. This engine even found its way to NASCAR as the Hemi replacement due to the powers that be imposing a 6-liter displacement limit. That's when Chrysler gave us the 355 NASCAR engine. In the 1990s, the LA engine received a series of upgrades and was dubbed the Magnum. This upgraded engine served as the base for many V6, V8, and V10 configurations. Yes, even that V10 Viper engine. The Magnum engine became the staple for powering the then Dodge Ram pickup truck line. Getting into the 2000s, the Ram was in its third generation and the Magnum was knocking on the door of being 35 years old. The rising need for cleaner emissions, higher fuel economy, and lower production costs meant that the engine's days were numbered. In stepped Bob Lee, Chrysler's Vice President of Powertrain Product Engineering. Bob knew that it was time for a redesign of Chrysler's V8 engine line. Ford had already stepped away from pushrod engines years ago with the introduction of the modular overhead cam engines, and by this time it was already 10 years old. GM revamped their venerable small block V8 by developing the LS1, a new generation V8 that retained the pushrod setup. Chrysler was faced with a choice on which direction to go. Do they develop a new generation pushrod engine or go overhead camshafts? What configuration would give the best power and torque while remaining clean and economical? Strangely enough, Bob found inspiration in the most unlikely of sources, the Porsche 911 series. One thing to keep in mind is that Chrysler in no way invented the hemispherical combustion chamber, nor did they have a monopoly on producing such engines. They only trademarked the name. The truth was that many cars used this type of combustion chamber setup with great success, and the Porsche 911 was one of them. Using codename 901 that was later changed to 911, and that's another video for another time, Porsche's air-cooled flat six-cylinder was introduced for their 1965 model year 911. It featured overhead camshafts, well, they were on the sides, but you know what I mean, and hemispherical combustion chambers. Displacement was 2 liters, and it cranked out 148 horsepower. This engine evolved over the years of its existence, but kept the basic air-cooled overhead camshaft Hemi-headed configuration. By the time it was finally retired in 1998, it had grown to 3.6 liters and produced 296 horsepower in normally aspirated form and 402 horsepower in twin turbo form in 1997. This engine powered what was now the 993 that ran from 1995 to 1998 and served as the inspiration for the new V8. The 993 engine generated a lot of power for its size, even normally aspirated, while remaining efficient and clean. Everything the Ram trucks needed. An efficient, clean-running V8 that was powerful enough to provide the power and torque a truck required. Bob and his team concluded that for their requirements, a V8 with a hemispherical combustion chamber would offer the most bang for buck. But they wouldn't simply take the existing LA engine and slap a pair of Hemi heads on it. This was going to be a completely new engine. Another concern was displacement. I mean, after all, by 2003, anytime someone mutters the name Hemi, our minds immediately veer off to imagine the king of cubes, the 426 Hemi. But in an age of low emissions and fuel economy, the replacement would not be displacement. Chrysler settled on a very smart 5.7 liters or 345 cubic inches. The block for these new 5.7 Hemis would be cast iron. Since this engine would be mass-produced and would see its way into a variety of vehicles, keeping it cast iron would not only provide some durability, but also be cost-effective. During the design phase, Bob and his team were able to consult the father of the original 426 Hemi, Tom Hoover, on how to best design the engine. After reviewing the needs and goals of the new Hemi engine, the team collectively came out with 3 goals. The first would be to raise the position of the camshaft. In a Hemi engine that isn't overhead cam, valve train is critical. The intake and exhaust valves had to reside at a certain angle that isn't very conventional. The early Hemi engines addressed the issue with a short, long-arm rocker configuration that worked, but wasn't the best at efficiency. Raising the camshaft would allow for shorter push rods and a rocker arm design that replaces short, long rocker arms with equal length rockers. You can see how high the hydraulic roller camshaft sits, causing the roller lifters to lay almost horizontally. This saved horsepower as well as reduced the risk of a bent pushrod. Goal number 2 would be to modify the combustion chamber to incorporate a squish area to increase drivability during low speeds and under light loads. This mod would also help reduce emissions. Goal number 3 entailed a twin spark plug design. The first one would fire right before top dead center like it was supposed to, but the second plug would fire shortly after the first plug to further ignite any unburned gases, further increasing efficiency and reducing emissions. The left and right cylinder heads are manufactured from a single casting and machined to make the right and left sides. The combustion chambers were a different story altogether. Upon initial inspection, it's easy to see that they were very different from your traditional Chrysler Hemi engine. It had the dome, which was shallow, and the sides were taken in to increase the squish area, so the diameter wasn't particularly round like the predecessors. Many enthusiasts will even go as far as to say that this is not a real Hemi engine.
No. No. Mm-mm. Mm-mm. No. 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 Hell no. 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 I refuse. No. No.
However, this was the type of combustion chamber needed to work with today's fuels and meet today's standards as far as mileage and emissions were concerned. And even at 85 cc's, it produced a healthy 9.6 to 1 compression ratio. The valves were held closed by a set of beehive valve springs and opened by a hydraulic roller camshaft that sported a 472 lift intake and 460 exhaust. By the time Chrysler engineers were finished with their design, it shared very little with its predecessors, including the Porsche engine that inspired it. Overall, it was still a Hemi. In fact, Chrysler gave it the Hemi name, but for marketing purposes, expressed it in all caps. The square intake ports measured 161 cc's, flowed roughly between 250 and 280 CFM, and fed the cylinder through a 2-inch intake valve. The square exhaust ports measured 55 cc's, flowed between 160 and 180 CFM through a 4.850 solid exhaust valve. Let's take a look at some more aspects of the new Hemi. The engine block would benefit from what's known as a deep skirt design, meaning that the crankcase portion of the block would extend well past the crankshaft centerline. This would provide strength by forming a sort of girdle as well as allowing for cross-bolted mains. The pistons were cast aluminum and transferred power to the nodular iron crankshaft via powdered metal connecting rods. The intake manifold was referred to as an integral air-fuel module. This is because it was a plastic monstrosity comprised of several individual components with the sole purpose of distributing the intake air to all the cylinders and to do it quietly to keep the throttle noises down. The entire assembly weighed 13.7 pounds, much lighter than an aluminum unit would have been. Air was fed to the engine via an 80mm throttle body. The first configuration of the new Hemi engine became the upgrade engine for the 2003 Dodge Ram pickup, replacing the LA-based 5.9 Magnum, but still offered alongside the 4.7 PowerTech overhead cam V8 and 3.7 Magnum V6. Producing 345 horsepower and 375 pound-feet of torque, it produced 100 more horsepower and 40 more pound-feet of torque. A much welcomed improvement, and the new Hemi was just getting started. The new Hemi engine added to an already nice package in the Ram pickup, and the truck took Motor Trend's Truck of the Year honors in 2003. The powertrain received high praises from all over. For 2004, the Hemi expanded to the Dodge Durango and became the upgrade engine with a slightly lower horsepower rating at 330. In 2005, the Jeep Grand Cherokee received the 330-horse Hemi, while the Dodge Magnum RT and Chrysler 300C were treated to 10 more horses with their Hemis, a no doubt key player to the 300 garnering Motor Trend's Car of the Year top honors. This is also the first year of Chrysler's Multi-Displacement System, or MDS. Introduced in the 2005 300C, Dodge Magnum, and Jeep Grand Cherokee, the MDS eventually became available on all 5.7 equipped vehicles with an automatic transmission from 2005 to 2009. All Ram trucks were excluded. In a move to improve fuel economy, the MDS will shut down 4 cylinders when the throttle is closed or the vehicle is cruising at steady speeds. For the performance-minded, Chrysler took things up a notch with the introduction of the 300C SRT8, a buffed-up 300C equipped with a 6.1-liter Hemi that cranked out 425 horsepower. Now, this isn't merely a bored-out 5.7. The last thing anyone wants is an engine suffering from thin cylinder walls, so they started out with a completely new engine block, with a 4.055-inch bore versus the 5.7's 3.92-inch bore, and retained the same 3.58-inch stroke to achieve the 6.1-liter displacement, or 372 cubic inches. The engine blocks were painted Hemi orange to mainly help them receive the proper machining on the assembly line, but it's also a nice touch for their performance engine. They also have a 6.1L cast on the driver's side of the engine block. The rotating assembly consists of a forged steel crankshaft and full-floating hyper-eutectic pistons on powdered metal connecting rods. The camshaft was pumped up with more lift and duration with a 571 intake and 551 exhaust. The cylinder heads featured a smaller 74cc combustion chamber for a 10.2-to-1 compression ratio, with larger 188 square intake and 194 D-shaped exhaust ports. Valve sizes were 208 intake and 1.65 exhaust. The plastic intake was replaced with a barrel-shaped long runner aluminum intake and 80mm throttle body. The intake combination was good for power from 2,000 all the way up to the 6,200 RPM redline. The entire engine package produced 425 horsepower and 420 pound-feet of torque, a much-needed shot in the arm for a car like the 300C. The 6.1 SRT8 engine really boosted the car's reputation. By the way, MDS was not an option for the 6.1. In 2006, the 5.7 continued in all of the previous vehicles and added the new Dodge Charger RT and Jeep Commander. The Charger received the 340 horsepower version, while the Jeep retained the 330 horsepower engine. Like the Charger's sister vehicle, there's also an SRT8 option for the Charger to make room for the 425 horsepower 6.1-liter Hemi. The 5.7 Hemi found its way into the Chrysler Aspen for 2007. We were also introduced to the new Dodge Challenger, which were all SRT8s, meaning that it received the 6.1 Hemi exclusively. 2008 was the last year for this version of the 5.7 Hemi. Through its tenure, it made a pretty good impact on the industry, but it suffered from some problems. The biggest issue being dropped valve seats that seem to have happened most if that particular engine suffered from overheating problems. It was enough of a problem for a recall to be issued on all 2005 to 2007 Hemis to have the issue addressed. However, the vast majority of the 5.7 and 6.1 Hemis enjoy long lives of up to 200,000 miles or more. During the tenure of the 2003-2008 5.7 Hemi, Chrysler engineers took plenty of time to observe. Through their observations, they found what worked and what needed improvement. They got to work on the new and improved version of the 5.7 Hemi, codenamed Eagle. Starting with an all-new engine block, the Eagle block was cast to be stronger than its predecessor, evidenced by its 31-pound weight increase. These new blocks also received a 5.7 cast in the same place on the side as the 6.1 engine. The rotating assembly also benefited from beefier connecting rods. The cylinder heads were next on the redesign list. Combustion chamber volume was decreased from 85 cc's to 65 cc's, then increased compression ratios from 9.6 to 1 to 10.5 to 1. Intake and exhaust valves are increased to 205 and 155 inches respectively. The ports in the new Eagle heads are redesigned to increase flow as they more closely resemble the SRT8 heads with its rectangular intake and D-shaped exhaust ports. These new Eagle heads even outflow the SRT8 heads. The new Eagle engine retained the MDS system, but also added a variable camshaft timing or VCT system. This new system, like the MDS system, was designed to increase fuel economy. The VCT system advances and retards the camshaft timing as the engine is running to keep it at peak efficiency at all times. This new system made its way to all 5.7 equipped vehicles regardless of transmission. The new Eagle Hemi also received an active intake manifold. This is the long runner intake with a flapper door that will switch from long runners to short runners for better high RPM operation and continues the use of an 80mm throttle body. This intake was installed across the board in cars as well as Ram pickups. Horsepower numbers varied slightly from vehicle to vehicle, but it ranged from 363 all the way to 399 and 394 to 410 pound-feet of torque. Now, in 2009, Dodge offered a drag pack option for the Challenger, but with no Hemi engine, just the 5.9-liter Magnum wedge engine. However, for the 2010 model year, Dodge refined the package to feature the 6.1 Hemi. This engine was treated to a forged steel crankshaft and connecting rods, forged pistons, revised valve lift in the hydraulic roller camshaft, and a modified high ram intake manifold. The 6.1 SRT8 engine continued until 2010. While it was a great engine, the horsepower wars were escalating exponentially, and Chrysler needed to keep up. Enter the 6.4-liter engine, codenamed Apache. Displacing 392 cubes, its size is the only thing that it shares with the Gen 1 392. Starting with a fresh block, they utilize a 4.09-inch bore and a 3.72-inch stroke. The rotating assembly consists of a forged steel crankshaft, powdered metal I-beam connecting rods with cracked cap design, joined to full flooding hypereutectic pistons, complete with oil squirters to promote cooling. Compression ratio is a stout 10.9:1. The cylinder heads are basically an improved version of the awesome flowing Eagle heads. With 73.4 cc combustion chambers, they feature a 2.14 intake and 1.65 exhaust valves, making them one of the best flowing third-gen Hemi heads with a 340 CFM intake port. The 6.1 hydraulic roller camshaft has an increased duration of 286 degrees for the intake and 288 exhaust, while the valve lift matched the intake lift at 571, but exhaust was decreased slightly at 536 inches. The 6.1 uses the same active intake as the 5.7 Eagle, as well as the MDS and VCT. The same rules apply. The MDS will only be used on automatic equipped vehicles, while the VCT will apply to all. Final pound numbers for its release in 2011 vehicles was 470 horsepower, 470 pound-feet of torque. It was offered only in the Dodge Challenger SRT8 that year. For 2012, in addition to the Challenger SRT8, Chrysler extended the application of the 6.4 into the 2012 Charger SRT8, Chrysler 300 SRT8, and Jeep Grand Cherokee SRT8. Things pretty much remained the same for the cars throughout the 2014 model year. For Ram's truck line in 2015, the Cummins diesel is generally the engine of choice for those looking to pull heavy loads. However, there are those who may do some medium to heavy duty work with their trucks and don't necessarily require the grunt of a diesel. Chrysler saw the need for an upgraded horsepower engine and included a heavy duty 6.4 engine spec'd out for the 2500 series trucks and up. Starting once again with a new engine block with a thicker casting, shorter water jackets, and a higher nickel content for added strength, this one would be known as the BG or BGE block. They're easy to tell, as these initials standing for a big gas engine are cast either on the side or the rear of the block. They're also painted black. The rotating assembly is unchanged from the standard 392. It's the cylinder heads where things begin to change. While still remaining the dual spark plug arrangement and valve size, they're good for a 10:1 compression ratio. Cast from 356 T6 aluminum, they're a bit more resilient to higher temperatures, as opposed to the heads on all other Hemis made from T319 aluminum. The camshaft was made a little smaller and geared more towards low-end torque rather than horsepower. The intake manifold is also different, even though it still utilized the variable runner design. With a top-mounted throttle body, it's made to work with the camshaft to deliver torque down low in the 3600 to 5000 RPM range. For the 2500 and 3500 Ram pickups, the 6.4 was good for 410 horsepower at 5600 RPM and 429 pound-feet of torque at 4000 RPM. For the chassis cab, Engine output was slightly lower at 370 horsepower with the same torque numbers. Twenty 2015 also brought us one of the most significant variations of the Gen 3 Hemi in the form of the newest addition to the stable, the 6.2-liter Hellcat. When I say the most significant variation, I mean that at this juncture, Chrysler, well, Dodge in particular, tired of being stuck in the muscle car friend zone with Mustangs and Camaros bringing in the big horsepower numbers. So they stopped trying to play nice with everyone and decided to step out and do what they used to do, dominate. They confidently walk into the engine room and unhooked the collar on the 800-pound gorilla they apparently had hidden in the closet, gave him a 55-gallon drum of espresso from Costco with an Everclear chaser, and unleashed him to the world with one purpose.
Smash.
And that's exactly what the Hellcat did. Named after the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter plane from World War II, this engine of the same name starts with the same 6.4 Apache BGE thick, high nickel content engine block, but with thicker webbing and also with longer water jackets that go all the way down to encompass the piston even at bottom dead center. The bore remains at 4.09 inches, but with a shorter 3.58-inch stroke like the 5.7-liter Hemi. However, it doesn't use the 5.7 nodular iron crankshaft. This new one is forged steel. The connecting rods are still powdered metal, but are of a thicker casting with upgraded rod bolts. The full-floating hyper-eutectic pistons are replaced with full-floating forged pistons with oil squirters to promote cooling. The material atop the piston is also thicker for added strength in addition to the built-in support ribs. Cylinder heads are the same as the 6.4 passenger car engine, but are cast in the more resilient 356 T6 aluminum. With the Hellcat-specific pistons, compression ratio is 9.5 to 1. The valve train is operated by a new camshaft with a 571 536-inch lift for the intake and exhaust respectively, and a duration of 278 and 304 degrees. MDS is not used on any of these blower engines, but they do continue to use VCT. This bulletproof combo is topped off by a 2.4-liter twin-screw supercharger developed by IHI specifically for Chrysler. It's capable of 11.6 pounds of boost in stock form. It's equipped with internal charge coolers that keep the inlet air temps below 140 degrees Fahrenheit and is sealed for life with its own synthetic oil supply. Fed through a 92mm throttle body, it can spin up to 14,600 RPM, pumping 6,000 gallons of air into the engine per minute. This entire combination works together to produce a whopping 707 horsepower and 650 pound-feet of torque. The first cars to receive this beast engine were the 2015 Challenger SRT Hellcat and the 2015 Charger SRT Hellcat with glowing results. The Charger Hellcat official FCA performance numbers were 3.7 seconds for 0 to 60 with an 11.8 second quarter mile. The Challenger also posted a 3.70 60, but blistered the drag strip with an 11 3/4 mile on street tires and 1080s on drag radials. For comparison, the Camaro ZL1 ran a 12.3 and the Shelby GT500 posted in an 1180. The overall reception of the Hellcat was nothing short of electrifying. At the time, the Hellcat Challenger and Charger were two of the most powerful vehicles from the factory on the streets for under $65,000. Usually a vehicle like this would be touted as a special edition, meaning that its production numbers would be limited, but not Chrysler. There were over 9,000 orders for these cars, with Chrysler fulfilling 8,502 of them. The Challenger led the sales with 7,168 units produced and 1,334 units for the Charger. – 2016 brought us the latest Challenger drag pack with two special Hemi engines. The first was a 5.7-liter or 354 cubic inch all-aluminum Hemi with a 3-liter Whipple twin-screw blower mounted on top to supply the forced induction. For those who preferred their engines naturally aspirated, there was an all-aluminum Gen 3 426 Hemi available as well. Other than the drag pack, it was pretty much more of the same for all model lines. There weren't many changes to any of the engines, because why mess with a good thing, right? Hemi-powered vehicles were the hottest thing going and showed no signs of slowing down. In fact, things were picking up. 2017 was more of the same. There was a Hemi for every taste, from mild to wild, with Hemi-powered vehicles appearing everywhere at this point. For 2018, Chrysler stepped things up once again with the introduction of 3 new Hemi-powered vehicles through its various outlets. The first being the Durango SRT. The versatile Durango has been a part of Dodge's lineup since 1998, entering its 3rd generation in 2010. It received the 5.7 Hemi in 2011 for the Durango RT and was pretty much a mainstay in the lineup. However, in 2018, things changed. Dodge got hold of the 6.4, now with 475 horsepower, and dropped it under the hood for not only a useful SUV, but with all-wheel drive, it's a useful SUV that's a straight riot to drive on the streets. With a 0-60 time of 4.6 seconds and a 13.2 quarter mile, the 6.4 Durango SRT definitely hauled the freight. Speaking of riots, the folks at Jeep weren't about to be left out in the cold. Since the Grand Cherokee shared the same WK2 platform with the Durango, Jeep decided to take things a step further. Instead of the 6.4 BGE engine, they opted for the 707 horsepower of the 6.2-liter Hellcat engine and called this all-wheel drive beast the SRT Trackhawk. And what a beast it was, with a 0-60 of 3.3 seconds and blistered the quarter mile with a time of 11.7 seconds. But there is yet one more cruise missile to unleash upon the public, and this one was a bunker buster in the form of the 2018 Challenger SRT Demon. Dodge wanted 2 things from the Demon: 9-second quarter mile times and to lift the front wheels during launch. 2 things that have never been achieved with a production car. For those kinds of times, this Hemi had to be something special. So they took the 6.2-liter Hemi Hellcat engine and made it stronger with a beefed-up rotating assembly to handle the extra power. The cylinder heads remained the same with the new camshaft specific to the Demon. On top, the 2.4-liter blower was replaced with a larger unit, displacing 2.7 liters. Boost pressure is raised from 11 psi to 14.5. With the compression ratio remaining at 9.5 to 1, the new Demon engine produces 808 horsepower and 717 pound-feet of torque on 91 octane pump gas and will belt out a massive 840 horsepower and 770 pound-feet of torque when running race fuel. The end result was beyond anything produced by, well, anyone. Whereas the SRT Hellcat Challenger was the 6th most powerful production car in the world, the Demon was the 4th. When that power is transferred to the pavement, 0-60 comes up in a mere 2.3 seconds. 100 miles an hour follows shortly at the 5.1 second mark, and the quarter mile is ripped off in a mind-boggling 9.65 seconds at a blistering 140 miles an hour, making it the fastest production car in the world at the time. And yes, it can lift the front wheels during launch. For 2019, the Durango SRT and Jeep SRT Trackhawk continued as is, and the SRT Demon was a one and done for 2018. The Challenger Hellcat got a 10 horsepower increase through improved breathing from a new dual snorkel hood, but that's not the only upgrade. For 2019, Dodge decided to take the Demon engine, 2.7-liter blower and all, and place it in a basic Hellcat to come up with the Hellcat Red Eye. With a slightly more restricted intake, the Hellcat Red Eye produced a still formidable 797 horsepower and 707 pound-feet of torque. They took the Demon underpinnings and placed it under a drag-focused street challenger powered by a 485 horsepower 6.4 Hemi and called it the Scat Pack 1320. For 2020, everything pretty much remained the same, although the Red Eye engine made its way into the Charger to make the Charger Hellcat Red Eye, making it one of the fastest production sedans in the world. Dodge also released the Challenger SRT Superstock. The Superstock was powered by the same Hellcat Hemi that powered the Red Eye, but was slightly tuned a little more to make 810 horsepower. One other Challenger Dodge offered was the latest version of the Challenger Drag Pack, this time powered by an all-aluminum supercharged 354 Hemi. Over the years, Chrysler has changed ownership a few times. It's not really surprising, as many of the American auto manufacturers have been bought and sold in order to stay afloat. Many well-known brands have even been cut in order to drop what they consider to be dead weight. Plymouth, for starters. Ford closed down Mercury. GM killed off Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Saturn, and Saab. In 1998, Chrysler was acquired by Daimler-Benz for $36 million. While we got some good cars out of the merger, things didn't really work out for the two companies, and Daimler sold Chrysler in 2007 to Cerberus at a loss for $7.4 billion. Then in 2008, the recession hit, causing Chrysler to file for bankruptcy in 2009. Through a series of government loans, Chrysler emerged from the financial crisis spread pretty thin with a coalition of owners. In 2014, Chrysler was purchased by Fiat and became Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, or FCA. They continued on as a company until 2021, when FCA merged with the French-owned Peugeot SA, or PSA Group, renaming the conglomerate Stellantis. Headquartered in Amsterdam, Stellantis consists of 16 automotive brands overall. For the 2021 model year, things heated up once again with the introduction of 6 new Hemi-powered vehicles, getting crazier as we go. First, there's the Jeep Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer, 2 plus-size SUVs that are entering the ultra-luxury realm. The Wagoneer comes equipped with a 5.7-liter Hemi, producing 392 horsepower, while the Grand Wagoneer gets the 471 horsepower 6.4 Hemi to move all that weight around. The next Jeep model was the Wrangler Rubicon 392, also sporting a 6.4 Hemi boasting 470 horsepower. Now, Ram trucks have been pretty quiet. After the introduction of the 6.4 BGE in 2015, the truck guys haven't had much to complain about. I mean, generally, if they want to go fast, they'll park the truck and jump into a Challenger or Charger. The last fast Ram truck was the Dodge Ram SRT-10, a rear-wheel drive Ram with a 500 horsepower Viper V10 under the hood that ran from 2004 to 2006. However, this new truck would be nothing like the SRT-10. Starting with their 5th generation truck, they took their Ram 1500 Rebel and stuffed the Hellcat engine under the hood, making the Ram TRX Launch Edition. At 702 horsepower, this was the first performance pickup since the Ram SRT-10. Dodge, being the ever-steady rebel of the bunch, was determined not to be outdone and took their Durango SRT up a notch and stuffed the 710 horsepower Hellcat engine in it, making the Durango SRT Hellcat. Unfortunately, this was a single-year only model run. Rounding out the 6th vehicle was Dodge's latest Challenger Drag Pack. There have been minor updates to the car, but the biggest change is the revised 3-liter blower. Horsepower numbers for the Drag Pack have been unreliable at best, which is why I never gave any concrete numbers. But it's safe to say that it's cranking out numbers in the 1200 to 1500 range, but that's only a guess. Word started to get around in late 2021 that 2023 would be the last model year for the Hemi as far as passenger cars were concerned. It really wasn't a surprise to any of us. The Challenger and Charger platforms were starting to get pretty dated, and there were no prototypes on the horizon. However, the people at Dodge wanted to let the world know that they weren't done yet, with the release of the 2022 Charger and Challenger Hellcat Jailbreak Edition, complete with an 807 horsepower Hellcat Hemi, thanks to some creative tuning. The standard Hellcat is also still available if you want to call 797 horsepower standard. For 2023, Dodge announced the last call for Chargers and Challengers. I'm sure Ram Trucks and Jeep will do something similar. With it being the last year for the Dodge vehicles, they're offering a variety of special edition cars, but nothing new as far as the Hemi engine itself is concerned. You can still get a 5.7 standard Hemi, a 6.4 392 Scat Pack, SRT Hellcat, Red Eye, Super Stock Challenger, or Jailbreak. If you fancy an SUV, Jeep still has a variety of Hemi-powered vehicles, including their Trackhawk. If you still want a Ram TRX, you better get your order in while you can, because after 2023, there will be big changes. However, thanks to Mopar.com, many of these Hemis are available in the form of crate engines as long as there is a demand for them. You have a choice of the 5.7, the 392, Hellcrate 6.2, or Hellcrate Red Eye 6.2, and the all-aluminum Elephant 426. This third-generation Hemi engine, what can I say? It appeared on the scene in 2003, beginning in trucks and finally found its way into cars and SUVs. In 2015, things heated up with the introduction of the Hellcat that plunged us into the greatest muscle car era since 1970. While the Hemi may be gone from the world stage, it will evoke the fondest memories from muscle car enthusiasts. Chrysler built this engine to take full advantage of its design, and boy did it ever. You can have your W16s, your dual overhead camshafts, and your Tesla Plaids. Give me a Hellcat with that infamous blower whine. There will be nothing, and I mean nothing, like the 20-year run of American muscle we just witnessed. The Big Three gave us the best they had to offer and got better each year. We were inundated with loud, rumbly V8s that could run 11s, 10s, and sometimes even 9s right off the showroom floor. There will never be an era like this again, which is why we must always seize these moments in life. Make your best memories today, because your best time is right now. Don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of American muscle and sports cars available to purchase brand new, but the Chrysler Hemi will be sorely missed from among them. However, there will still be plenty roaming the streets, and will be for a good while. The Chrysler Hemi left the premises as the Alpha, the winner, the greatest of all time. It was one hell of a run. So what's next? Stellantis has already introduced their Hurricane 6-cylinder engine as a replacement. I'm sure it's going to be a great power plant and plenty fast. It's just not the Hemi. I know that I may sound stuck on this engine, but don't worry, I'm not. This is because life goes on. Hemi or no Hemi, while I love watching the new Hemi products emerge from Chrysler, instead of mourning the loss of the Hemi, I'm going to be happy that I got to experience the greatest muscle car renaissance in history. This isn't the end. We'll get through this just like we got through the OPEC crisis, or the end of the first muscle car era in the mid-70s. We survived unreasonable smog laws and sealed carburetors. We survived catalytic converters and OBD2. And we'll survive this. Because in the automotive world, we improvise. And just when you think you have us figured out, we come back better than ever. So here's to the Chrysler Hemi. In a world that didn't see a need for you, you came in and showed us why we absolutely love you so much. Rest easy, Hemi, the greatest of all time. The last of the pure muscle. Until we meet again.